A related set of activities are the indicators that have been developed to focus specifically on environmental sustainability. And I'm going to talk about two examples of those, one very briefly and one in more detail. The one I want to talk about briefly is an index developed by Yale and Columbia Universities called the Global Environmental Sustainability Index. And then I want to talk about Australian State of Environment reporting as an example of national state of environment reporting. So if you go to the website that's listed on the bottom of the page, you'll find material that ranges in size from this, the full report, right down to something that's more like this, about half a dozen pages. And the link that I've given you there is to the short 6-page version. So you might want to have a look at that report and try to understand how the authors have ranked countries around the world in terms of environmental sustainability. And here's a graphical representation of the results where more green is more sustainable and less green is less sustainable. And you can see some fairly predictable sorts of outcomes there. Australia and New Zealand, Canada, parts of Western Europe rate fairly highly, parts of Africa and Asia and Central America rate fairly poorly. The authors acknowledge that that's rather unfair because it's making comparison across countries with very different capacities to engage in sustainable behaviour. And so they've undertaken a second analysis in which they segregate the data into countries that have got similar characteristics and look at how those sorts of countries that might be comparators are doing. And so they produced a second ranking which has got a different set of colours. The detail here is not particularly important. What I want to draw your attention to is that there's a significant effort internationally going into this sort of activity and producing global scorecards of how countries are performing. And the idea of doing this is to have leverage on policymakers to say, you need to lift your game, look at what country X is doing relative to country Y, how can we develop policy measures that improve our situation. So I'm not going to spend time talking about the detail here, unless anybody wants to pursue anything in the question. I'd rather ask you to have a look at this report, only 6-page summary, and think about the information that the authors are presenting. Any questions before I go on? So let's talk about other forms of state of environment reporting. And I've given you here links to a number of international sites that have also focused on producing state of environment reports on particular topics. The first of those is the World Conservation Monitoring Centre, which is focused on conservation of ecosystems and species. And they produce a report called Conservation of the World's Ecosystems. You can look at maps and data tables at their website that give you some sense of what they see as the priorities globally for conservation efforts. The second of the points here, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organisation, its activities are organised largely around different sectors. So, for example, the forests of the world or the world's fisheries. And FAO produces a series of state of the world's forests or fish or drylands every couple of years to try to provide policymakers, the international community, with information about the issues challenging sustainability in that particular sector. There's a cohort of international environmental NGOs that produce similar information about issues of concern to them, and I've given you an example here from an NGO in Washington, the World Resources Institute, that has a website called Earth Trends, and as the name of the website suggests, that site allows you to access information about trends in particular resources. So they're particularly concerned, for example, about what they call frontier forests, forests that aren't subject to human development, They're particularly concerned about fresh water and about grasslands. And finally, many countries globally have adopted state of environment reporting for that country. And I'm going to spend the rest of this class talking about what Australia does in state of environment reporting as an example of what's done internationally. So if you go back to the 1996 State of Environment Report, which you can access through the website or, if you prefer, in the library in hard copy, you'll see that the approach that was taken in Australia was to recognise that there were three components of the natural environment that needed to be sustained. What we call natural capital, ecological integrity and biological diversity. And I imagine that those terms are fairly self-evident to you. And then there's a set of objectives in the way that the reporting system was developed that are essentially about being efficient and about being useful and about being effective in communicating results to policymakers and to the public. At that time, the State of Environment Reporting Initiative was a legacy of the previous Labor government that was continued by the previous Liberal government. And the commitment was made that Australia would produce a State of Environment report every 5 years. So we now have 3 Australian State of Environment reports with the dates that you see shown there. And the reports are produced by independent experts who are contracted to do that work by the Department of Environment. The first 2 assessments reported under 7 themes, the first 7 themes that you see listed on the list. And in 2006, because of the growing interest in the Antarctic was added as an additional reporting theme. You can look at the summaries of each of these online, and you'll find that generally, varies a bit from report to report, but generally the format of the report is to provide access to the data on which the summaries are based, some key messages, and things got better. Have they got worse? In which ways have they got better? In which ways have they got worse? In which ways are they about the same? And then to provide some expert commentary on what the results mean. So I'm going to now work through some examples from recent State of the Environment reporting to give you a sense of the way in which this information is presented and a sense of some of the key messages that are coming out. Before I do that, has anyone got any questions about what I've said so far?
Who are the experts?
Who are the experts? People like me? What can I say? Generally they're people who are scientists, or in the broad sense, including social scientists who work on cultural heritage as well as on natural sciences. They tend to be employed by universities or by state or federal agencies, but mostly by state agencies because the federal government restricts its role to putting the report together. If you look on the website, you'll see listed who the individuals were. So as an example, in 1996, the person who led the report on the terrestrial environment, the land theme, was Bob Wasson, who became director of what's now the Fenner School for 5 years before he went to Charles Darwin University. So people like that. You'll see that I did some work on fire in the 2006 State of Environment report, and I'm going to come and talk to you in a couple of weeks' time about fire. I'm going to encourage you to read that. It's great. Another question?
Yeah, did you say that the ABS only recently began to release environmental information? So when did they start doing that?
About the report that I showed from 2002 was, I think, the first time that they formally reported specifically environmental information. And they continued to do that. Has anybody here worked at the ABS or worked at the ABS? Because some of the people who did that work were graduates of our programs. My understanding is that they're not getting as much support for that work now as they did 5 years ago. So I'm not sure about their capacity right at the moment to do that. But it was a recognition on the part of the statistician that that agency had a responsibility to report on a wider range of national indicators than just the census-related data, for example, that they traditionally reported.